Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that gives you a peek inside the minds of some truly inspirational teachers. This week, I'm joined by Sarah Farrell, and together we're going to talk about all things primary mathematics. Hi, Sarah, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. I mean, you name me the only two that ask me how I am. Everybody else just sort of gets on with it. It's very polite. So to kick things off, we always start with our guests and numbers, just to get a feel for who you are and where you're from. So my first question is years as a teacher.
7. Although technically I was on maternity leave last year, so I don't know if you count that as a year or not.
Oh, that definitely counts. Years as a maths lead?
Actually, only since September, so not even a whole year, I'm afraid.
First year group taught?
Year 5.
Last year group taught?
Also year 5.
Most important year group?
I feel like that's a bit of a trick question, because if you didn't have any of the year groups, then the rest of primary education would make sense. But I think year 3 is often overlooked in terms of the jump from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2. So could potentially be seen as one of the most important year groups.
Favorite year group?
Either year 5 or year 6. I would sort of jump between the two.
Blog posts at mrsfclassroom.wordpress.com?
54, amazingly.
Nice, that's impressive. Daily maths puzzles?
157 now.
And tweets?
I couldn't quite believe this when I saw this, but 6,138. I'm not sure what any of them have said, but yeah, 6,000.
Well, I mean, you're normally tweeting daily maths puzzles and resources for teachers to use as well. You know, you say you've only had a year of maths leadership experience, but whenever I said to sort of Neil and Shannon things, you know, who will I ask to talk about maths? Because I try and have a maths episode in every season, and yours was the first name they said you should talk to Sarah. I was like, yeah.
Oh, that's good.
You know, so you've definitely been sharing lots of positive things and things that are useful to teachers. So you're a teacher, mathematics subject leader, and author of the hashtag Daily Maths Puzzle. Tell us about your journey and how you got here.
Well, I actually did a degree in English and Education at Academy Christchurch, and then did my primary PGCE there as well. So nothing maths related at all. Moved to Bristol in 2014 and started working in a year 5 class. In the PGCE, all my placements were actually in year 1, despite the fact that I asked to be in upper key stage 2. And I did enjoy working there, but it made me realise that I'm much more a key stage 2 teacher. And while they were really sweet, it wasn't for me down in year 1. I've worked across years 5 and 6 over the last few years, so I've taken several classes from year 5 up to year 6, which has been really nice because you get that consistency across upper key stage 2. And I've led a few different subjects. I've led geography, art and reading for pleasure, and obviously now just taken over maths. When I was on maternity leave last year, I wanted to keep my hand in with school-related things, so I decided to start doing the daily maths puzzle. I had a subject lead role open up at my school, which I immediately knew I had to apply for, so I went for it and managed to get it, which was...
Tell me about that year 5 to 6 move. Was that planned by the school? So is that something they do all the time?
They tend to do quite a lot of having the consistency of a year 5 to year 6 teacher, just because you do then get that you can sort of jump straight into year 6 without having to spend time getting to know the class again. I personally really like doing that. And also means that because you invest quite a lot in year 5, you get to sort of see the results in year 6 as well. And that would be my personal choice of how I would have things, of having the same teachers do year 5 then do year 6. If I were in charge of a school.
Nice, yeah. Whenever some of the Shanghai teachers visited for the Maths Hub sort of demonstration lessons, the exchanges, they talked about how they take the kids from first grade or whatever all the way through school, so they move up the whole time. I
don't think I'd go for that.
Then you go right back down to year 1 at the end. Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting.
I think that also helps if you've got children who maybe struggle with relationships. If you can then develop those relationships across that year, then they have that consistency and they don't then have to rebuild relationships with new people.
Yeah, I can see a lot of benefits. So you're extremely passionate about high quality mathematics education in primary. And it might seem like a really obvious question, but why is the highest standard of mathematics provision essential at our phase of education?
I think the maths that we introduce children to forms the foundation for everything that they go on to learn in maths. So even something as simple as adding 1 to a number, they need that knowledge for absolutely everything else they come across. And if we provide them with those strong foundations, where they've got the good knowledge of place value, the relationships between numbers and things like times tables and number bonds, then they can start to make those connections between different concepts when they're introduced to them across Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and then into secondary school. So rather than just having sort of a shallow understanding of different procedures that they don't really understand, they've personally made those connections and sort of drawn on them, and then sort of developing that schema of being able to create like a network of everything that they've learned. So rather than it just being, oh, this is column subtraction, here are the 5 steps and how to do that, then they're gathering that for themselves and building that map.
Nice. I like that analogy. And you're absolutely right. You know, the pupils who really understand primary maths excel at secondary maths, don't they? And those who don't are essentially doing the same content until they're roughly 16 years old. What was it in your professional development that brought you to that realization?
I think part of it was quite early on, but working in the year 1 classroom that I was in for PGCE, because I was fairly confident with maths, although that developed more sort of when I began working in year 5 and 6. But being able to explain something to year 1 children who are finding something difficult, to being able to sort of break it down even further. I think when you're teaching Key Stage 2, you can break a subject down sort of to make it more and more and more simple. But when you're coming down to, say, adding 1 to a number, it's quite hard to then find more scaffolded steps to explain that. And so I think sort of having to really think about different ways to explain that same subject and finding different ways to present it to children who really didn't understand it sort of made me realise how important it is that they do get that, and that they can understand that from a different range of sort of representations.
Yeah, I've had that in planning sessions where I'm sitting thinking, how can I make this idea any more straightforward, and what, you know, is there another context I can put it in? You know, that makes total sense. Yeah, I can see where you're coming from, and yeah, and that's probably why we recommend so much that people spend time teaching in Key Stage 1, so they get that big picture of you know, how all those pieces connect, and that map that the pupils have as well.
I think as well, when you see children, I've sat across enough children doing arithmetic tests in year 5 and 6 to see this. When children come across, say, a column subtraction question, and they immediately just go to just subtracting the first numbers that they see, and you sort of see where their gaps are in their previous understanding. They're going, oh, actually, you don't really understand the concept behind this. You know the general sort of instruction list of how to do column subtraction, but you don't really understand what you're doing and why you're doing it.
That makes a lot of sense. So if you had to condense your approach to the teaching of mathematics into a set of guiding principles, what would they be?
I think, first of all, definitely making sure that arithmetic knowledge is sound before moving on to sort of the traditional sort of like reasoning. And I think it's really important that children are introduced to a range of different strategies, but they're then allowed to choose the one that they feel the most confident with. So I think there's real merit in introducing children to, say, addition using, say, number lines and rounding and adjusting, but then not expecting children to follow one certain method, to be able to use a range of different methods to find something that they are confident with working in, but then to be able to develop them so that they can, say, check their answer using a different method and not just have, you know, the one way of doing something. So that if they, say, come to a test or come to a problem and they have completely forgotten how to do, for instance, column subtraction, that they can draw upon those mental ways instead. I definitely think that regularly revisiting key skills is just absolutely essential, and we use Maths Mastery at my school, and my absolute favourite part of that is having maths meetings. So where they have a 15-minute session every day outside of a maths lesson to do those sort of little and often things that they really need to be seeing regularly, so like rounding or finding factors of numbers, and just sort of like drip feeding in those things that could just be sort of lost and forgotten. And you know, I find that 15 minutes really powerful in terms of helping children to remember those different sort of little skills. And definitely focusing on things like number fluency, such as times tables and number bonds. One thing that I really love doing with all of my classes is doing, if this is the answer, what could the question be? So we tend to do one of those a day, and it's really interesting seeing, say, the start of year 5, you might do that, say, what if the answer is 15, what could the question be? And they start off with things like 10 add 5 and 14 add 1, and then as they begin to learn different things, so say squared numbers, then they start coming up with say 5 squared subtract 10, and being able to draw on all of the things that they've learned and become quite creative with maths with that sort of fluency.
I think Chris will definitely be nodding along whenever you're talking about little and often. Where does that 15 minutes come in your school day? Think it practically. Is it additional or is it part of the maths lesson?
It's not in the maths lesson. So for us, it's just before break, and then after break we have the maths lesson, as in the day is timetabled to within an inch of its life.
Yeah, it almost needs to be. I mean,
yeah,
15-ish years ago, I couldn't fit all the subjects in, and I didn't. There was no expectation that I was teaching to the same standard that there is now. Certainly there wasn't the focus on it. So I can only imagine what timetables are like. Certainly it dominates conversations sometimes. Are they built into maths mastery? So there's no additional resourcing, or do you guys identify what you want to focus on and then use that time as you see fit?
Maths Mastery come up with a list of things that they suggest covering. So they come up with a list of things for each half term or each term that they suggest you covering. But then we build in a lot of things from assessments that we do to thinking, okay, well, they've all found this a little bit tricky, so we'll just add in one of those questions maybe once a week or twice a week. So I always have every single day, I just play a 6-digit number, we read the number, we do say 10, 100, 1,000 more or less, and we round it to say 100,000, so that we're constantly getting that place value, because I'm always banging on about place value, but because it's so important for even being able to say add and subtract numbers and just to understand what numbers actually are, having that time to do that every day is really useful. And even then for the less confident mathematicians that I've got, they then begin to see that because they're hearing it every day, it begins to sort of drip feed in, and even if they're not putting their hands up to join in, they're becoming more confident with it. And then I had a few successes with children who have found maths really difficult, and then because they're hearing that every day, they've sort of started to join in with those bits and have a go at them, even if they're not confident.
At the end of season 3, Berkeley Everett talked about something similar to, where you're talking about being able to choose from a range of different strategies and things. And he talked about how he would sort of guide so that all the different ideas were listened to and things. Is your approach where you teach and then provide them with the option, reminders, you could choose this? Is that across the whole school, or is that something that you do and you want to bring across the whole school as subject lead?
Something, so we've just brought in to my school something called Arithmetic Mondays, where on a Monday we're teaching a specific mental or written calculation strategy. So for instance, rounding and adjusting, or partitioning and adding, partitioning and subtracting. So in that time every week, we're introducing the children to a new skill, always with the 4 operations, but those different mental and written ones, and then giving them an opportunity to do calculations there. So we're trying to get them more confident with those different skills. So then when it comes to, say, a word problem lesson, we then encourage them to be using whichever strategy they're most confident with. That is something that we're hoping to then develop more this year, of saying it doesn't always need to be written, and sort of encouraging a bit more of the mental strategies as well.
Nice. It's my favorite bit of mathematics, possibly. And during lockdown, the April lockdown, the first one, I got to do it with my oldest. And I just had so much fun looking at the different ways we can think about number, because and people will have heard me banging on before about how it negates the need to move on to the formal algorithm, in Key Stage 1. For us, it's built into our curriculum sequence. When I'm talking to people, I will point them towards, I think it's an old National Strategies book called Teaching Children to Calculate Mentally. Where did you get your key learning points from, those mental methods? Are they built into Maths Mastery, or is it something you've designed yourself?
They are. I did start to do them myself. Then I realised that Maths Mastery actually had a document that already did it. So I stopped trying to reinvent the wheel. But no, they had a document that covered all of the different strategies for each year group. So we're using those at the moment.
Nice. That's perfect. Because I love whenever you're in the middle of something and you realize it already exists. Yes, I can put that to one side.
It depends how far you've got through the project.
Very true. So in your opinion, what's the single most important aspect of mathematics education?
I'd say times tables. I've shared before a poster about sort of where times tables are used in the curriculum. And it's really surprising when you look at them, how many concepts rely so strongly on a good understanding of multiplication and division facts. So everything from ratio, fractions, obviously things like long multiplication. If those children have a really fluent understanding, then they're so much more likely to be able to see the different connections. So if you've got children who are really confident with their times tables and they see a fraction like 9/12, they can immediately see, well, I can see what the common factors are there and can simplify them much more easily. So I'd say if that's always what I'm always banging on about in class, of going, if you know your times tables, I promise you everything we're going to cover is going to be so much easier. And when it comes to things like calculating, say, area, if they've got a question that's 400 multiplied by 30, if they know that number factor, 4 times 3, then immediately they can use that to help them. I think that's where a lot of children fall down, in that if they don't know those, they have to really work to try to do them. We might see them trying to do, say, a long multiplication question for that. You think, that's just, you're not going to end up getting the right answer by doing that.
Too many zeros involved for that to go right
just
every time.
A sea of zeros, you think that's not going to be right.
Yeah, and it's like those connections you're talking about, seeing the connection between multiplication and area, you know, and light bulbs start going off and things, the world makes a whole lot more sense. What's your approach as a school to helping your pupils learn their times tables?
We use Timetable Rockstars, which is really good for getting that fluency up, and for obviously because it's games that they enjoy, they are much more likely to be playing them and to tackle them. We had a few things that we were doing before lockdown, so we haven't restarted doing again yet, but where we've had times table certificates and aiming to get them for sort of bronze, silver and gold for learning the multiplication and division facts. And I'm in the moment sort of trying to think of a way to redo that without it being having to go and see a teacher to be tested. So trying to think of a way to sort of reduce the load of doing that, but still getting that working towards a times table. We do also have we've mapped out the times tables and number bonds for Key Stage 1 across the year for all year groups. So every term, each class is focusing on a times table. So this term we're focusing on our 12 times tables, and that is part of the expectation for homework, is that you are learning your 12 times tables. And then every Monday when they come into school, they have just a short 10-question quiz rather than a test, of seeing those times tables and seeing them not just, 1 multiplied by 12 is equal to 12, but seeing them, for instance, with the missing box or with the answer box at the beginning. So they're getting used to seeing those different representations, and then hopefully by the end of the term being really confident with their 12 times tables, so we can move on to our next one.
Yeah, I think that moving towards a systematic approach like that is really sensible. We mapped ours out by the week. I think we've got 37 unique tables, facts that we want our pupils to know. And if you were to commit one to memory every week from the start of year 3, I think by week 8 of year 4 you'd be done.
Wow.
We yet to see if that's actually possible, but I think outlining what you want to be learned and when makes a whole lot of sense. Whereas I think definitely when I started teaching, I was just sort of hoping that they learned them, and the practice we were doing was sufficient, but it probably wasn't at the time. Thinking about your principles, what might they look like in a school that was doing a particularly good job of teaching mathematics? So you've got the sound arithmetic, the focus on those methods, and then that fluency. What might that look like in practice in a school that was doing a good job of that?
Well, personally, I think having a weekly arithmetic lesson is really powerful, especially for when you're coming on to say you're learning about, say, shape or data and statistics. Still being able to focus one lesson a week on those strategies means that they're never being overlooked and you're always getting that input on them. So I think definitely having a weekly arithmetic lesson. I would say if there is time in a timetable, having some form of a maths meeting is incredibly useful. I mean, a few years ago started doing a SPAG meeting in a spare 15 minutes I had, which I found them really useful for sort of going into writing lessons in sort of a similar way of sort of SPAG and arithmetic being the building blocks of writing and of, say, reasoning. I definitely think a focus on correct vocabulary. So often I've seen teachers say using the word sum for like a multiplication question, and just being really clear that actually sum means addition, and making sure that you're using that correct vocabulary. And then giving children a chance to articulate their learning using that vocabulary, using sentence stems to explain how they've calculated their answers, again in a way that shows that depth of understanding rather than just a procedural knowledge. So being able to explain how they know using that concept rather than just talking through a method and happening to get it right.
So those arithmetic lessons, Are they, so does your week look like one arithmetic lesson, 4 on the main theme that you're following? So you've always got that.
So I have an arithmetic lesson, which we'll have a little time on the times tables. We'll teach a specific strategy, so say rounding and adjusting. We'll have a spotlight on different question styles. So for instance, having the answer box at the start. And then, we've only just introduced this bit last Wednesday, doing a quarter of the arithmetic test that I made for year 4, 5 and 6. So just 9 questions a week, and then going through those and really digging into which strategies they've used for those questions. So say if it's a question where you're adding 10, going, actually, you don't need to write out a column addition question here. You can just add on 10 mentally. So a chance to explore those different strategies. And then across the rest of the week, we then have our 4 lessons on whether it's shape or ratio, whatever happens to be, but always that arithmetic lesson specifically focusing on the strategies, especially because they build in so much into the rest of the curriculum. And it means that we can have, say if you're coming up to a unit on converting metric units, then that Monday lesson could be spent doing, actually we're just going to look at multiplying and dividing by 10, 100 and 1,000. So then we know you're confident with this, or we know the children who aren't confident with this, and then you can use that to support throughout the rest of the week, so that they've got that calculation knowledge and then they're applying it to that concept.
And are they the kind of conversations you're having with your teachers, or are the teachers having between each other during their planning sessions, that kind of thing?
Yeah, we're still quite early on in that we've only introduced the arithmetic sessions from September, and so we're still sort of early on in using those. But already with it's teachers thinking about which ones they particularly want to focus on, and using the Math Mastery document to find which of those objectives would be the most useful to cover. A lot of just using professional judgment to think, actually, what do we really need to work on, what's going to be the most useful for this upcoming unit.
Nice. No, that makes a lot of sense, and it seems like you've really thought it through in terms of how you support your pupils in making, really meaningful connections between the mathematics they learn about and that they need to practice. Do you think there are any pitfalls that those schools who struggle to provide a decent standard of maths education fall into, that those listening should aim to avoid?
Probably the biggest mistake I've seen in maths is, this is the old differentiation conversation, but of differentiating by giving, say, bigger numbers rather than differentiating by scaffolding. So I think there's a lot of, these children, then it again goes into the sort of the glass ceiling of actually you're capping certain children off at certain abilities and going, okay, well, you can add 4-digit numbers, so you're going to add 6-digit numbers, even if that's not part of the year group objectives. And I mean, my school is in a really fortunate position that we actually have iPads for every child. And I've been exploring so far this year how to use scaffolding using the iPads to make sure that children have got access to what they need to help them in that specific objective. But that, say, in their books, it might look like they've all been doing exactly the same thing, but that they can explain what they've used to help them get there. So whether they've used a multiplication grid or they've used a place value chart, being able to explain to someone that they know where to get the support from. Then also, again, using the iPads and trying to reduce the huge amount of printing, because I am guilty for printing far too much. I've been experimenting with having a 3-page document for each lesson, and having sort of like the middle one of going, well, here's a list of questions. If you're confident, then have a go with these questions. And on the sort of the first sheet, having actually, if you're confident, then here's something that's going to challenge you a bit more. So say when we were doing column addition, that more challenging sheet might have had the words, the questions written out in words rather than in numbers, so that if children were really confident with addition, then they're challenging themselves a bit more to apply that place value knowledge. And that then the sort of final sheet would be, actually, if you're really struggling with this, then here are some different prompts that you can use to help you. So that, and I always use the same questions throughout, so they're not getting different sets of questions. So that if they're starting off and they're thinking, actually, I'm really, really struggling with this, they can use that 3rd page. And then as they're getting more confident, think, actually, I'm going to try doing it on the second one without the prompts, or actually even maybe going to the 1st page and thinking, actually, I can do this. I really want to challenge myself, without you having to print out hundreds of pieces of paper in order to support that.
And will the teacher guide the pupils towards the sort of the ballpark they want them to start operating in, or is it totally self-selecting by the pupils?
I think there's a lot of, I think to begin with, it's some prompting, and then moving on to self-selection. I think there's always going to be those children who are either really overconfident when really they need to rein it in a little bit, or those children who sort of choose something that's a bit too easy for them. I always tend to say to mine, if you aren't confident, then by all means start with the sort of the more scaffolded option, and then saying if you're getting that one right, maybe for the next one just try that without the scaffolding to see if you can do it. I think there's definitely a lot of sort of training to go on there with children going actually, and I think a lot of it is saying if you get it wrong, it's really not a problem, that's part of learning. If you go for that middle one and actually you make a mistake and it goes wrong, we can work through it together. Maybe you'll try again in a few questions to do it again without that scaffolding.
Yeah, and like you said, if the mathematics in all 3 pages is the same, really,
and they can skip between them.
It's just the point of entry that they're getting to choose, which sort of which avoids the situation you were describing, the pitfall, when the first group have numbers to 20, the next group have numbers to 100, and then the next group have numbers to 1,000. Yeah. And I was actually exploring the Maya number system, and I think getting pupils, if they're really good at place value and if they're really good at calculating, they should explore that number system, because it couldn't be more different from ours. Like it's got a vertical organization system. It's in base 20, so you're getting quite large numbers, and it's got a combination of dots, dashes, and images, glyphs, I think it's the proper term, so if in doubt, look at the Maya, look at the Romans, and go that direction instead. So you've talked about Maths Mastery a bit, which is a high quality textbook program.
All digital resources.
All digital, but someone's mapped out the curriculum, and it's got that journey from year 1 to year 6.
Yeah.
What, in your opinion, what are the features of a high quality mathematics curriculum?
I think definitely well sequenced objectives, so that build across the year, but also build across through the year groups, but with opportunities to revisit. So making sure that children are confident with that same objective from the year before moving on to in that current year group. So you say, for instance, before you move on to adding 6-digit numbers together, making sure that they can add 4-digit numbers together from the previous year group. Definitely that focus on language, making sure that they are being exposed to that language and they're using that language and they understand what that language means. Again, as I mentioned, the scaffolding and not differentiating. And I think having a lot of opportunities to talk. So whether that's having, say, just speaking using the sentence stems, or having a problem that you're working together on the board, but having that opportunity to articulate their thinking and to discuss different ways that they've solved a problem, and that's sort of jumping back to the mental strategies we mentioned earlier, being able to discuss which one's the most efficient and why. And I think building in chances for reasoning, so through having, say, proving answers, or looking for different like say finding the odd one out with calculations, or finding all the possibilities, having those different opportunities to do that, no matter what the ability of the child. Because again, I think a lot of the time challenges can be seen as just being for the children who are achieving the highest in the class, but having those challenges so that even a child who has gone through column subtraction, for instance, and found it a bit tricky but has got there in the end, that they've got a challenge that that's challenging for them, and that they can access. So they're still seeing, for instance, can you find a mistake in this column subtraction? Can you prove this statement? Rather than them just working on the fluency.
Reasoning for everybody was the John Mason quote. If you're not doing reasoning, it's not mathematics you're teaching, something along those lines. Some really interesting ideas there. The ones that jump out at me are language, scaffolding, and talk. I reckon it'd be really interesting to take them one at a time. Where do your teachers draw the accurate language from? Is that something that your curriculum provides for you, or is that something that you as subject leader have the responsibility for disseminating?
So we are in the fortunate position that Maths Mastery do provide us with a sort of vocabulary list. I have also made a vocabulary list, which I did before we became a Maths Mastery school. So again, that sort of starting project, then it being done for you. But we do have that list of vocabulary, because obviously there's so much vocabulary that's used in maths. It's choosing the specific pieces that you want to teach and to use, rather than just having, oh, here's the 20 words that we need to learn this lesson. It's thinking, well, actually, I want to make sure that you understand product. And we're going to just make sure that today we use product, we use digit, and we use sum, for instance, if we're looking at long multiplication, and making sure that children can use those words in context, and that we avoid having, say, going 3 times 2, using the correct vocabulary for that.
I did a lot of talk with our teachers about vocabulary when I first started my current role, and now things like quotient, dividend, minuend, they're just part of the local lexicon. The teachers certainly, and lots of the pupils will talk about it and they'll be able to identify. And I think it makes a big difference to how the pupils can articulate what it is they've understood. So that makes a lot of sense. And I like that you're almost drip feeding pieces. You're not going to give them here's the whole vocabulary list. And we've got something similar. And the more a teacher will teach in a year group, the more they'll know to feed certain words in September for the payoff that it brings in March, kind of thing. It makes a lot of sense,
And then if you're, say, if you've done product, for instance, when you've been doing long multiplication, then when you come through to, say, doing area, and if you just display the word product and see if children can then build that, the knowledge of going, oh yes, I remember doing that from when we've covered these different objectives, we must be using that in this lesson, and be able to explain what it then means. And it's again all about building those connections between the different areas of maths.
The scaffolds along the same lines, I assume they've been mapped out, the models, images, representations. How much of the decision-making process comes down to you and your teachers?
So say with Maths Mastery, we find that you're given a lot of different models. And what we're working on this year is making sure that teachers can use those different models, but choosing the ones that are most useful for them. So rather than saying, okay, well, we've got to teach them to do this, 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 and this, going, actually, I want to really focus just on these 2 to begin with. So having the sort of the opportunity for all of them, but then just choosing those specific through a few.
Nice. Yeah, I think most schools will probably find themselves in that position where they've got the entirety of the models, images that are possible, and having to make decisions about which ones are most pertinent for their pupils, and then sequencing them across the year groups. And then we discussed talk on the podcast a while ago. How do you guys facilitate that talk in your maths lessons?
So we have talk tasks, so which is again a feature of Maths Mastery lessons, where there'll be, say you've introduced a concept, there'll be a chance to tackle that as a pair, and it's a scaffolded talk in that you provide the sentence stems, and so you model that with a child or with another adult in the room, and then children use that language using the context in a way that they've heard modelled, and then be able to apply that to the questions that they can then see. I think that definitely having the sentence stems there is really powerful to say, rather than going, okay, solve this problem, you're thinking, okay, we'll solve this problem and this will help you to sort of guide you to do so.
All makes total sense. I think having that organized approach to those key markers makes a big difference in terms of teaching and learning, and ultimately what the pupils remember in mathematics and understand. So how do you guys approach planning, over the long and the short term?
So we have the long-term outline that comes from Maths Mastery, and we adapt as need be for our class. So personally, I like to map out each half term in terms of the lessons that I'll cover. So basically just because I like being really organised, but then with the knowledge that it will need to be adapted and that you might need to spend longer on certain objectives. So I'll tend to have like that whole termly plan of going, this is what ideally I'd like to cover, but I know I might need to shift it around. Then when it comes to each week, map out the objectives to cover in each lesson and choose warm-up or starter activities that help to build towards those skills. So a bit like mentioning earlier with coming up to metric units, probably in that week, all of my warm-ups and starters would be multiplying, dividing by 10, 100, 1,000, just to really get that in there. Sort of the short-term planning is something that I want to really look at this year in terms of maths lead, and making sure that those different features are coming through in every single lesson, and that you've got the specific vocabulary that you want to be taught, and making sure that that talk is scaffolded and is a part of every lesson.
So then, do you guys have a template that you record your planning on, or is it up to the teacher how they approach it? So you've got the big picture, perhaps a medium-ish picture as well, and then from there you'll decide what's right for you.
Yeah, so as part of the planning process, it's that we've got the videos available on Maths Mastery, so we use those. Personally, my planning is just by creating a PowerPoint. We're a 2-form entry school, so I create that to help for both me and my partner teacher to have those to hand. I'm not a big fan of sort of teaching like to a PowerPoint, if you like, but it is handy then having just those words visible and having, say, some discussion tasks up there. But when it comes to like just doing a calculation, I'm always much more, here's a whiteboard and pen, or a sort of visualizer, and do it in books, again, to hopefully get children to know you need to write each digit in each square, you need to use a ruler, and help model those expectations.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, because if I ever have to write a word problem out, I'd much rather have it pre-prepared on a PowerPoint slide than have to sit and write it out, because you lose a bit of the back and forth if you're constantly writing these new problems out. Whereas if I have a my turn, your turn, example problem pair, it's much easier, so I completely understand what you mean about lots of our teachers, certainly in those schools that don't use a textbook exclusively, will use PowerPoint as their vehicle, because they can add notes to it. It becomes like a living document that people have conversations. Then equally, whenever I'm planning with them, we can all have it open at the same time and sit and play with and things, so yeah, I totally get that. I think anything that helps your teachers sort of save time and focus their attention on what's important is
a similar sort of tactic, if you like, with planning our maths meetings. So I'll tend to do those all one term in advance, and I think once you've sort of done the first week, it's a case of changing the numbers, so it's not too time consuming to do. But I always have that on PowerPoint, so that you've then got what you're going to go through, and you've got those questions ready. And so one of the things that we're focusing on this term is having word problems with the numbers hidden, displaying the word problem, having the numbers hidden, and saying, okay, before I show you the numbers, don't just add them together randomly. How are we going to approach this? So looking at what the wording is, discussing together what the approach will be, and then going, okay, when I show you these numbers, then we're agreed. The first step will be you convert the litres to millilitres. The second step is you're going to add those together, and so that then you've discussed that they've all got a strategy and they can all just go for it. And again, if you didn't have that pre-planned, then that will become a lot harder to do.
Nice, that's gold. Yeah, thinking about the structure before you think about the numbers, because the numbers can distract them, can't they?
And they do just add them or multiply them or subtract them as they see fit, without thinking, oh, well, that one of those is in litres, one of those is in millilitres, I need to change those before I do anything with them.
Yeah, I'm going to steal that, or certainly borrow it. Because I often, I quite like looking at the connection between problem structures and bar models, and can pupils write problems that match the bar I've drawn on the board, that kind of thing. But they, and I've seen Gareth Metcalf do stuff with it's completely numberless, maybe numberless graphs, that kind of thing.
Bar models, another thing that I've been doing, because I noticed that quite a few of our children, I think part of it was coming back from lockdown, but they were struggling with the language and with the with representation, so they sort of just lost that a little bit. And so if I was saying how many are there all together, and they would go, I think you subtract. And so looking at that language, and so I made a resource which had 4 possible answers written in the corners. It was, say, 12 add 4 is 16, 12 subtract 4, 12 multiplied by 4, 12 divided by 4. And then having a question or a representation in the middle, and then showing them that slide and saying, okay, the answer is going to be one of those 4 possibilities. You don't need to try to calculate it. It will be one of those 4, but which one will it be? So thinking, are you seeing 4 lots of 12? Are you seeing 12 divided into 4 sections? And so again, it was taking off that pressure of having to come up with the answer and just thinking, okay, what am I looking at here? Which has then really helped in terms of that language coming back and the getting more used to seeing those different representations.
Particularly when pupils struggle to focus their attention because there's so much going on, maybe they get limited working memory capacity, whatever. I think that can be really, really useful. So tell me about your approach to writing the daily maths puzzle. What's the process like?
Well, I always start off by deciding what I want the focus to be. So say, for instance, finding the area. Then I always add in at least 2 steps that need to be done before the area can be calculated. So it might be having to find the length of one side first, or it might be having to use, if, for instance, I put then a circle in there as well, having to use the knowledge of the diameter and radius of a circle before they can calculate the area of a shape. And so they're designed to draw upon the knowledge gained across Key Stage 2. So with most of them, they can definitely be done by the end of year 6, but then with things like, say, the radius and diameter of circles, they will need to have had that knowledge first. But they're designed to encourage children to think about what information they already know and use that to then work out the remaining information. So yeah, there's always sort of those 2 steps that need to be done beforehand. And those are the kind of things that because I've got a 1-year-old, so I tend to be up in the night quite a lot. That's what I do to keep sane when I'm up with him, is just to think about a maths problem and then write it down when I wake up in the morning as a way to keep awake and keep busy.
It's a really productive use of time. And it sounds like you're inspired by what you're covering in class as well, because a few times you sort of said, oh, I made a resource for this because I needed to address this issue. So will you be thinking about your own class and the classes in your school while you're writing those problems?
Most of the time it's thinking about those skills that, again, from having sat across enough children taking SATs tests, of knowing that actually whenever they see circles, they forget what they're looking at. They struggle to remember those different facts. So all of the ones that I've made, or most of the ones I've made, are based on shape and fractions, decimals and percentages, and just getting a chance to sort of explore those different things and to draw upon knowledge that's gained elsewhere. So I know, for instance, that there's the objective in year 6 to find the area of parallelograms, and obviously they then learn how to find the area of parallelograms, but it's a chance to then apply that knowledge in a different context in a time that's not related to the current learning, but that'll come up at some other point during the year. And yes, those sort of things that they learn the procedure of how to do, but then don't necessarily get that practice with. And I'm sure you've seen in SATs papers where they'll have several different squares and rectangles all put together and have one side where they've given you a measurement, and then children just sort of multiply it by 4 or just add together the first numbers they see because they're not sure how to approach those questions. Whereas if they are using, say, the maths puzzles, then they'll hopefully get a chance of going, okay, slow down before you do anything mathematical, look at it. What do you already know? What do we need to know before we can calculate that?
Nice. You can see subtle little hints at your thought process coming through in your response there. And in thinking deeper about mathematics, there's a bit in possibly the reasoning chapter where it says think like an exam writer. And if there's ever a second edition, it's going to be think like Sarah, because I'm going to go back and I'm going to show this just like I would with Garth's task. Why has Garth made the decision he's made? I'm going to look at your problems and then listen to this bit and then say, okay, how can we replicate this? Because I'm fascinated by the way people write problems, because, I think that there are a finite number of problem structures and that every problem is just a combination of or one of those. And to see how people approach making things that appear novel and the expectations of pupils, I think is brilliant. So I'm definitely going to be listening back to that response with lots of my teachers going forward.
A rambly response.
No, not at all. But the thing is, you're thinking on this level. This is something that is just part of what you do now, isn't it? But you definitely were sort of revealing sort of parts of your process as you responded. I think it was really clear how many levels you were thinking about that problem writing process. And I can't believe you're doing it with the 1-year-old. Because I remember when the boys were 1, and it's definitely the toughest part, I think.
Oh, I'm very lucky that my husband stays at home with full time, so I'm back at work full time and he's at home with him full time. So I'm very lucky in that regard, that I can focus on work.
Excellent.
And then obviously get to spend sort of evenings and weekends with him.
So what would you recommend anyone wishing to develop their mathematics prowess, in terms of teaching, should read, like books, papers, blogs, podcasts?
I think definitely 100 Ideas for Primary Teachers by Shannon Doherty. It feels I'd recommend a bit to you, but your book is really useful. I've actually got it over here next to me. Maths Mastery Reasoning by John B as well. So I've got the Key Stage 2 book from him, and I'd like to get the Key Stage 1 book as well, but with the sort of different representations of questions is really useful. I think there are so many different good resources. I mean, Twitter's an amazing place for seeing different recommendations. I really need to be more organised with how I sort of save things, because I keep emailing myself links and then I never look at them again, and then I'm trying to find something in there somewhere. But there are so many amazing people to follow and different things that crop up that I would recommend Twitter to everyone who's looking for different resources. It's always, oh, have you gone on Twitter? Have you followed these 6 to 8 people?
My bookmarks on Twitter are a mess. You know, I bookmark lots of stuff. Oh, I'll definitely go back and read that. And then it's just this massive list of things that I've forgotten why I was interested in them.
I did see someone suggested making a Padlet for yourself of different resources. So I might have to force myself to be organised and do that, just to have a visual. These are these useful resources for different things.
I was using Padlet with my teachers during our staff meeting last week. I might go and repurpose that that set of Padlets for my for my bookmarks, because something needs to happen. I don't know. I'm sure there must be an app for it somewhere.
It must be.
So your work has inspired many and will continue to do so for a long time. Where do you draw your inspiration from?
Well, I think firstly, I've really struggled with maths in primary school and in secondary school. It didn't help that my brother is an amazing mathematician. So he could do sort of like year 9 stats papers when he was in year 6, and he's done a physics degree. So immediately, I was very much, I'm not as good as him. And so I think from having then struggled with that and having someone tutor me in maths when I was in primary school, and knowing that I found it difficult, when I then went into teaching, I found that actually that was really useful, because I knew where children were going to come unstuck, and so you could sort of think about that in advance, and where my brother would be a terrible primary maths teacher because he would just be like, well, why don't you know that? So I think having that sort of knowledge of going, well, I found this difficult, I'm guessing that's where they're going to find it difficult as well, and seeing where those common mistakes will happen and be able to sort of head them off at the pass. That's where I came across, or I came up with doing the arithmetic tests. To think, okay, if I'd had that when I was in primary school, and I'd had one of those a week, and then I'd been able to target that specific skill, then I would have found that really useful. So I'm sort of thinking back to myself what I would have found useful in primary school. Also, I'm one of those people who really I hope it's not make me sound terrible, but I always find the sort of mistakes in things, or the gaps in things, and I love then sort of seeing something and thinking, okay, I'm going to make something that fills that gap and that does what isn't currently being done. I'm also quite a perfectionist with resources, so if I find something, I'm like, I think I could probably improve that. So I always like to have something that I'm working on to that hopefully other people will then find useful.
That empathy comes across when I talk to, I think we have quite a few maths leads, maybe not talking about mathematics specifically on the podcast, but definitely I remember Andy talking about how he wasn't a fan of maths when he was at school, so he wanted to be the best maths teacher he could be and the best maths lead he could be. I think Lisa as well. It definitely comes up a lot in the real world too. I think you can't underestimate understanding how the pupils who are struggling feel, because I think that's when you're best placed to support them and overcoming the barriers that we may have struggled over ourselves when we were younger.
And thinking back, so when we said about breaking things down, that if you've got a child in year 5 who's struggling to do something, thinking, okay, well, I can break it down to sort of like year 3 level, year 2 level, year 1 level, until you get to the level where they think, oh yes, now I can see the connections there. I think if you were a natural mathematician, and although obviously that'd be amazing if you were into it would be very useful, but you might then struggle to break it down and think, oh, they should know that, so why don't they know that, and get frustrated, I suppose.
Probably a very different tolerance threshold before you get frustrated. I know certainly in things that I find easy and I'm trying to teach my children, I'll get quite frustrated quite quickly. Why can't you just play Mario the way I want you to? jump on the brick, jump on the maybe not the most practical example, but whereas with mathematics and things, I'm definitely not more patient. And do you have any final advice for teachers who feel energized and ready to up their mathematics game?
Knowing that, because I think maths can be seen quite often as being quite a dry subject and quite sort of formulaic, and it's often the subject that I think people are going, oh, I was rubbish at maths when I was at school. So I think introducing children to the fact that you can be quite creative with maths. So as I mentioned earlier, one of my favourite things to do with children is if this is the answer, what could the question be? And I've got some examples up on my blog of some responses that I had from year 6 before with that, where they would come up with, say, fractions and use fractions and BODMAS together and be able to really play with number and to be able to explore it. And I think being able to have that opportunity or give children the opportunity to play with number, to explore it, to look at different representations and to sort of have that chance to do it in their own way is really powerful, in that it stops it from being this is the correct answer, this is a wrong answer, but to have more sort of the different gradients of going, well, you can challenge yourself a little bit by having, say, that 10 add 5, or you can go, okay, well, you're going to have multiplying fractions and then adding in a cube number as well, and having that sort of that chance to do it at a level that they're comfortable at, to help sort of to change those perceptions of maths and to help hopefully stop children from going, oh, well, I just can't do maths.
Yeah, because that's the biggest challenge, isn't it? Those dispositions, because if they're not in place, then it's an uphill struggle, isn't it? What would success as maths lead look like for you? What's your long-term picture for your maths subject leadership? You've just come in, this is year 1. How do you see your maths subject leadership going? What are your plans?
Well, I'd like to look at developing maths mastery, so that, because I think the problem with when you have a scheme is it can be that you rely on it a bit too much. But having a look at, I love with maths mastery, for instance, the maths meetings, and I really like the 6-part lesson structure, but then helping staff to then be confident to use that structure, but to use it in their own way. I would definitely like to do some work on some of the things that we've been speaking about the language, about different representations, and making sure that all teachers are confident with that, and that they can suggest different ways of going across questions. One thing I've been looking at doing is trying to find or looking at books and how they link to the maths curriculum. So to try to introduce reading across the curriculum in that way. I've got lots of other sort of like half-baked ideas that haven't quite solidified yet. I think a lot of this year is going into other classes, because I think the real problem with teaching is that you don't get that chance to go and see other people teaching. And so once you sort of finish your NQT year, that's it, you're just in your own classroom. And so I want to use this year to see other people teaching, go into lessons and find out sort of where the amazing nuggets of things that are happening across the school are, and then how to say, well, actually, that's really great, we should all be doing that. And yeah, hopefully start to change again some of the perceptions. I think with parents, that can always be a thing, like, oh, I found maths really hard when I was at school, maths is hard, some people just can't do maths, and going, well, actually, no, you might find it difficult, but it's not you can't do maths. So I've started doing a maths newsletter for parents as well, with sort of some tactics for helping their children, and including some examples of, say, like, this is what a bar model is, this is how we use it in lessons, so that they then know if their children are sent home with a bar model for homework, they know what it is, they know how to use it. Nice.
I think you're hitting all the key markers that most subject leaders will be thinking about. They'll be thinking about language, they'll be thinking about things of pedagogy, and parents, in every context brings its own sort of challenges and rewards. So I think, I know that was a bit of a curveball at the end. I reckon it'd be really interesting to see where you are a couple of months, couple of years down the line, and maybe come back, you and Shannon can talk about maths subject leadership, and we get this picture of how your story has developed. I think that'd be really interesting if that sounds like something you'd be interested in.
I think it would be really interesting to connect with other maths subject leads as well, sort of share those ideas, because I've led, say, geography, but that's very different to leading a core subject, and making sure that I'm not just massively missing something, but to sort of share those ideas and say, oh, actually, this worked really well in my setting, it might work well in yours. So I don't know if there is that, like a group of maths subject leads, but I'd find that really useful if there was.
Yeah. I don't know if you used Discord before, but there's a math section on our Discord for thinking about primary education. Basically, that's what we do. We talk about there's one for education, there's one for like books we're reading, there's one for mathematics. Not everybody talks, but everybody's sort of there asking questions and things. And so, like, I was asking. Perfect. Yeah, it sounds like you're describing, like I said, but yeah, I'll the links on all the apps as well. I'll send it across on Twitter. I was looking for information on assessment in the foundation subjects, and then Amy Bills came out and said, here, well, this is what we do. And then I think Neil might have said what he did, and from there my school has developed, and I sort of said, this is what people who know what they're doing think, try that, so yeah, it definitely works. Yeah, so Bernard, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed that a lot more than that. Wasn't quite as terrifying as I thought it would be.